do I really want to see the newsfeed, or I'm just craving it because I need something to distract myself?
I highly recommend the first time you try something, you go for the smallest version possible.
It took 25 hours per video.
You're thinking about a presentation that's coming up and you're worried that people are not going to think it's good.
Oh my God, this is so exhausting, and there's so many other things I could be doing.
If my friends are having a dinner together tonight and I'm a little bit tired, it's completely okay if I don't go.
I was rigorously counting the hours I would spend every week on every single project that I worked on.
If you gave me that tool I could download and copy paste into my system, then I would become productive.
Have you ever paused an experiment in between of the many experiments that you've tried? In 2020, I stumbled upon a newsletter that changed the way I thought about thinking, learning, and just curiosity. And the writer, Anne-Laure Le Cunff. One of her emails was literally titled, "I fell in love with a blue heart." So obviously I was intrigued, and that email introduced me to one of my most cherished tools today, Roam Research. Anne-Laure has been an inspiration of mine when it comes to the quality of her blogs, how she scaled her newsletter from 0 to more than 100,000 people now, and just the depth of her knowledge. She is not just a writer, she is also a researcher, an entrepreneur, the founder of Ness Labs, and now she just added another feather to her cap as an author of the book Tiny Experiments. Tiny Experiments was published by Penguin and is now available on any bookstore out there where you get your books. In this episode, we talk about how small, intentional, tiny experiments can change the way that we approach goals, creativity, and learning. If you've ever felt stuck in a project, if you've ever felt like, gosh, I wish I can finish something, I keep starting so many things, this is the episode for you to watch. Let's dive in. So, Anne-Laure, I am thrilled that you're here, and I'd love to begin with this question that's been on my mind since I first read this article of yours a few years ago. So, there is this term called FOMO, which has become quite common in vocabulary these days. It's called fear of missing out. It's this anxiety that there's something more exciting happening out there that I'm not there for, and it really takes away the joy of the present moment. One of your most popular articles is called JOMO, which is the joy of missing out, and I just love the term, first of all, and I'd love for you to explain what does that mean and what does that mean for you specifically?
I love that term too. I did not come up with it. I found it in an article or on Twitter years ago, and it immediately resonated with me in the same way that it resonated with lots of Ness Labs readers afterwards. So the joy of missing out is the complete opposite of the fear of missing out. When you experience the fear of missing out, you're constantly worried about what other people are doing while you're not there. Should I actually participate in that activity or attend this event or do this thing or study this skill or this language? Because if not, I'm going to be missing out on something. That missing out might be connection with others, might be progression in your career, might be a sense of accomplishment, but there's really the sense of lack that is driving your actions and your decisions. When you take the opposite, the joy of missing out, then you decide from a positive place to not do these things. You decide that, no, actually, you know what? I'm going to stay at home tonight and I'm just going to have a nice cup of tea and read a book. I don't need to go to that conference. You know what? I'm not going to work extra hard in order to get that extra certification because I have all of the skills I need right now in order to do my job. And you know what? If my friends are having a dinner together tonight and I'm a little bit tired, it's completely okay if I don't go. My friends are still going to be there tomorrow, and it's okay if I miss out tonight. And so it's really changing your perspective from a place of fear and anxiety to a place of expansiveness and generativeness and really feeling like you're enough. That's what I love so much about the expression JOMO.
When you came across this probably a couple of years ago, how have you tried to implement this in tiny ways throughout your days?
For me, it's mostly asking myself whether I really want to do something or if the drive is actually, again, to not miss out. Am I making this decision from a place of lack, or am I making this decision from a place of joy and curiosity? So it's really just changed my way to approach decisions more in the way it's increased my awareness, really, of why I make certain decisions. It's injected a little bit of intentionality, a little pause before I make a choice. as to whether I'm going to join something or not join it. And because I do love connecting with people, I do love learning from others, the answer quite often is that I do end up joining the activity, but at least now I know it's coming from a place of intention, of joy, generativity rather than lack.
When you were saying that, I was thinking about how I have this one extension which is one of my favorite Chrome extensions. All it does is it blocks your newsfeed and then it shows a quote instead. And for me to then see a newsfeed on a social media platform, I have to go and there's a few clicks before I can like kind of show it again. And in those few clicks, the number of times I have wanted to see the newsfeed and then just the few clicks of friction made me realize, do I really want to see the newsfeed, or I'm just craving it because I need something to distract myself from something harder that I'm working on that's more important. I'm curious if, I'm sure there's some scientific backing, but as the neuroscientist on the call, can you share more about why does that friction work?
Yeah, we have so many automated responses that are very often the result of building habits. Our habits can be good, like brushing your teeth in the morning. You probably don't even think about it. You get out of bed, you go in the bathroom, you brush your teeth, you're half awake, and it just happens. And that's good,
Mm-hmm.
right? But you obviously also have bad habits. For some people, that might be smoking, for example, or for many of us, scrolling on social media. Just a way to get a little hit of dopamine when we're feeling a little bit low, when we're a bit bored, when we don't have energy to do things that are a little bit more interesting and creative. We just open our feed because we know that we are going to consistently get that kind of reward there. We just know it's going to be there because it's been designed to provide that for us. Because of that, it creates a habit. And the friction that you describe is really good because it really helps kind of reactivate your prefrontal cortex here, where you
Mm.
can take that little distance and actually look at your actions, look at your decisions from a place of rationality rather than from an automatic place driven by your emotions. And you can just
Mm.
look at it and say, do I actually want to scroll on X/Twitter for the next hour, or do I want to do something else? Very often in this case, the answer is no. And as you can see, it's kind of similar to what we were talking about with FOMO and JOMO. It's really about re-injecting a little bit of intentionality in your decision making.
Do you have any extensions or little things that has helped you a lot in injecting that intentionality from some external forces?
I don't use any extensions, but on my phone, for example, I don't have any notifications on for any apps that are social media or addictive, and I don't have them on my home screen either. So
Mm.
if I really do want to go and visit one of these websites, I need to go and open the web browser and then type the address and then go
Mm.
there. And even the experience is not as good. It takes a bit longer to load. And quite
Mm.
often, just adding that friction, it just gives me a little bit more time to have that rational thinking that can kick in. And while I'm waiting for this to load or trying to click through my phone to open it, very often I feel like I don't really need to check Twitter or, I don't need to do this. So I'm not doing this with an extension, but it's very similar to what you're doing.
Very, very interesting. I remember Near Eyal had this book come out called Indistractable. I haven't read the book, but I've read the summary of it, and he talks about how there is internal triggers and external triggers, and only about 80% of the time, sorry, only about 20% of the time, external triggers help. But you really have to get to a place where you feel like, I'm not the kind of person who will fall prey to these distractions. And having that internal, like, voice tell you that is very important. I'm just curious, do you have any research on talking about how to develop that internal trigger over time? Because these external triggers, like extensions, only can go so far, I assume.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of trying to develop both your metacognition and your interoception. So having both metacognitive awareness and interoceptive awareness. And those sound like complicated words, but they're really not. Metacognition just means thinking about thinking. So it's
Mm.
really observing your own thoughts. So instead of just having automatic thoughts that you don't control at all, you're not aware of, is really taking that little moment to notice, I'm thinking this, or where did that thought come from? How come this thought keeps on coming back? Interoception is similar, but it's directed towards bodily sensations. So that can be a little knot in your stomach. That can be your heart beating a little bit faster, your breathing being a little bit more difficult. Very often, those bodily reactions are linked to some form emotional processing. So, for example, you have a knot in your stomach, maybe you're a little bit anxious about something, or maybe you're a little bit stressed. By noticing these, instead of having an automatic reaction, I'm anxious, so I'm just going to scroll on social media, or I'm going to open the cupboards in my kitchen and eat something sugary because I know this is going to help in the short term managing the sensations. You're creating a little gap between the sensation or the thought and the response. Intentionality, again, I feel like this is going to be a theme in our conversation today, but this is the way you manage your internal triggers better by becoming more aware of them, whether the trigger is a thought or it's a physical feeling. And then you can design responses that you think are going to be healthier and more appropriate. So if you feel that knot in your stomach, maybe just get up and stretch or dance for 1 minute. That's going to be more helpful. If the knot is still here after that, if you can, go for a little walk, 5 minutes around the block, and then come back. If the knot is still there, and maybe it's cognitive, it's more recurring thought, you're anxious about something, you're thinking about a presentation that's coming up, and you're worried that people are not going to think is good, maybe in that case, something more at the mental level, call a friend or a colleague, have a quick chat with someone that can reassure you. And in this way, you're back in control, and not in the sense of being controlling, of trying to repress, right? But more in the sense of actively engaging with your thoughts and your feelings and your emotions in a way that's constructive and generative.
This reminds me of have you seen Grey's Anatomy? It's this famous medical drama series.
I haven't
Yeah.
watched the full thing like some of my
Okay.
friends have done many, many times over, but I know what it is.
Got it. There's an episode where they talk about this scientific study that tells you that if you like stand like a superwoman with your hands on your hips and you look up for 5 minutes before a job interview, it will help you perform better. And this became viral, I think, 10 years ago. And it sounds like kind of what you're saying, right? Just figure out some healthier ways to help yourself before you go in for something. Speaking of tiny experiments, your book, Tiny Experiments, will be launching very, very soon. I love the name, first of all, and I know you shared with me that you went through many iterations before you landed on the name. So what does Tiny Experiments mean for someone who's just seeing it for the first time?
So tiny experiments. I think actually it's funny that you're mentioning the long journey it was to figure out the right title for this book, because the first title of this book was Liminal Minds. And liminal means to be in the in between, to be in uncertainty, to be in transformation, on the threshold of something, on the doorstep of something new. And so, liminal minds, the idea of the book was really to help people be more comfortable in those places of transformation, in those places of uncertainty, which, when you think about it, life itself is a giant liminal space, right? It's a giant space of uncertainty. We never know what's next, right? And really achieve a lot more while having a lot more fun if we embrace that uncertainty, if we become comfortable, if that in that space of unknowing. Unfortunately, most people didn't know the word liminal. I didn't even know that word before I started working on this project. And so they felt like, if I don't understand the title, I'm probably not going to understand the book. So I had to go back and brainstorm what is a title that actually captures the essence of this book, but that people are going to understand, where they don't need to open a dictionary to understand exactly what I mean here.
Yeah.
And I ended up choosing Tiny Experiments because really, to me, that's the unit of change. That's the tool that is going to help you approach uncertainty from a place that feels playful and creative and generative in your life. So, the idea of a tiny experiment is that every time you face a challenge, a doubt, uncertainty, where you don't know what you want to do next and what you want to work on and what path you want to explore in your life, instead of being paralyzed, instead of feeling self-blame and shame as to why you don't know where you want to go and what you should be doing next, you can turn that doubt and that uncertainty into a tiny experiment. And the reason why is that this is basically inspired by the scientific method. When scientists are faced with something they don't understand, they don't stay paralyzed. They just ask themselves, how can I explore this? What research question can I ask? How can I test this idea, this hypothesis? So that's what the book is about. It's really about approaching any challenge, any source of uncertainty from a place of curiosity, just like a scientist would do it.
I love that you mentioned the word scientist there because the moment you said like a scientist would think, in my mind I was like, yeah, of course, scientists don't stop because their first experiment failed. They'll try again and again and again. Can you give an example of a tiny experiment? Because I'm sure your book is filled with case studies. Can you give like one case study for us?
I can give you the one that inspired that entire book and a lot of the work that I'm doing, my own very first experiment, which is what allowed me to launch Ness Labs, my current company. I decided to run an experiment where I would write 100 newsletters in 100 weekdays. The reason why this is an experiment is because you have a specific action and a specific number of trials. And what you do is that you withhold your own judgment until you're done. So you wait until you're done with the experiment to decide whether you liked it, whether it worked, whether you want to keep going. You just have to finish the experiment. So I did that very first experiment. And I mean, now, obviously, a few years later, I loved it so much that I kept on going and I'm still writing the newsletter weekly. Since then, I've conducted a lot of different experiments. I've done a YouTube experiment where I also said I'm going to do one video every week for 6 months. The result of this one was that I'm not a YouTuber. So I didn't keep going afterwards. I realized that this is not really my medium of expression. I love writing more, but I couldn't have known if I hadn't actually committed to exploring this idea for long enough. And you can really do that for anything, really. In the Ness Labs community, we have a lot of people who are running their own experiments. I've seen people run experiments with daily affirmations where they just wake up in the morning and they say something positive to themselves in the mirror for 30 days, for example. I've seen another member of the community that run a tiny experiment where every day they reached out to someone they hadn't talked to for a while.
Oh,
And they
nice.
also did that for a little while as a way to reconnect. I seen people experiment with their health routine, with their style, like fashion style, also trying different types of outfits. And you can really do this for anything. The thing that they all have in common, again, is that you commit to completing your experiment before you judge the result. And while you conduct your experiment, you also take little notes. Like a scientist, you observe how you feel, things that work, things that don't, because sometimes you can be very successful. I could have been successful with the newsletter and it could have grown really fast. And maybe I hated every second of writing it. That's not a successful experiment. So you need to really, again, practice this metacognition that we talked about earlier, observing your thoughts and observing your feelings.
Very interesting. I have so many questions on what you just said because the first thing I'm thinking of is how do you choose the parameters of the experiment to speak like more of a scientist? What's the boundary condition? For example, you could have also said, I'll do everyday newsletter for a year instead of 30 days. So do you have, I'm sure you have some qualification criteria for that.
Absolutely. The main criteria is whether you're going to be able to complete it or not. And that's also why the book is called Tiny Experiments. It's because I highly recommend the first time you try something, you go for the smallest version possible. If you really love it, then in your next cycle of experimentation, you can go for a more ambitious version of that experiment. In my case, I went for 100 articles in 100 weekdays because I had been writing online for a while already. It wasn't that new to me. And I needed the container of the experiment to really commit and explore this newsletter, which was completely new. But the online writing was not very new. If online writing is completely new to you, maybe just go for a couple of weeks. Just see already how it feels. Maybe 2 newsletters a week for 2 weeks. That's 4 newsletters. That's probably already enough data to have a little bit of an intuition as to whether you like this or not. So first, can you finish it? That's really the most important thing. And to know whether you're going to be able to finish it, go back to your level of familiarity with the experiment you're about to run. the newer, the more daunting or the more complex, the smaller your experiment should be. And the more familiar it is, maybe it's something you already know how to do, but you've been procrastinating, for example, you can go for a bigger experiment in those cases.
Very interesting. I feel like, when I thought of this podcast, I'm realizing now that at first I thought I want to do a podcast. And then I realized there's no boundary condition to that experiment, just saying I want to do a podcast. Then I told myself, let's do one podcast a week and then do 10 episodes first, see how we feel at the end of the 10 weeks, and then realize, do we want to continue this or not? So I think like hearing you say this is making me feel better because I'm telling myself, suspend judgment until the experiment ends. Don't think any, like take notes, but then don't make a decision to stop in the middle. It's very helpful.
If I had talked to you before I was done writing this book, you might have ended up as a case study because this is exactly what a tiny experiment is. You have
Right.
everything in there. You have the number of repetitions. You have the exactly what you're going to be doing. You have the suspension of judgment until the end. And if you're the kind of person who has any kind of self-reflection practice where you tend to pay attention to how things are feeling while you go through them, then that's everything you need for a tiny experiment. So I love that you ended up designing this project, this podcast project in this way, even before reading the book.
Yeah, to be very honest, I was talking to my mentor and I told him, Rajesh, I'm not sure yet. And then he was the one who said 10 weeks. Try 10 weeks and then decide. I was like, you know what, that makes sense. It's not too long, it's not too short, it's just enough. So going back to all the case studies you mentioned, I'm curious, what tiny experiments have you ever paused an experiment in between of the many experiments that you've tried?
Have I ever stopped?
Yes, paused it or stopped it. Yes.
Yeah. The YouTube one, actually, I did pause it because I was really struggling. So I stopped in the middle, took a break, focused on other projects that I had. And then I came back to it because I figured, okay, maybe the way I'm approaching this is not the best way to go about it. I talked to other YouTubers, I asked them about the process. And this is also part of the scientific method. If you've been running your experiment and something is obviously wrong with it to the point where it's really not going well at all, you might just pause your data collection, figure out what's wrong, and then keep going with the data collection. So I did that. And I felt at the time that maybe the reason why I was struggling so much was because I was not really good at video editing. So it was taking me a lot of time and energy to get to a point where I was happy with the result and that I could publish it. So I decided to work with a video editor and to really focus on the research, the scripting, filming the
Yeah.
raw materials and sending it to him. We did that for a few weeks and I was so happy with the videos that came out of it. But still, I was really dreading having to sit in front of the camera and having to talk to myself, which is so interesting because I have no problem with a Zoom call where I'm having an actual conversation with a
Yeah.
human being, but just me and myself in front of this like dead camera in front of me with no response whatsoever. I was the level of procrastination, I kid you not. I would start cleaning random stuff in my house. I would try like do so many other things because I didn't want to sit down and record. And so I figured out, okay, even with the video editor, video is not really my thing, and that's completely okay. So I finished the experiment, and after that, I decided, okay, there's no next cycle of experimentation with this one. We're done. We collected the data. We have our answer.
I mean, especially I think the word dread, that word itself like makes you feel like you want your life to have more joy, less dread. But of course, there are some things that are a challenge. I'm sure your PhD completion was not joyful every single moment. Or correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe it was for you.
Oh, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think exactly what you said is that if you're dreading something and if your bodily response is telling you, like, this is not it. And I'm trying to remember when I felt this way. I used to do YouTube videos 6 years ago. I was pretty prolific back then. I did the entire thing, including editing. And it took 25 hours per video. And I just felt like after a point, oh my God, this is so exhausting. And there's so many other things I could be doing. So, curious, when your case study is like, when you finish an experiment, what are some questions you ask yourself to be like, do I want to keep doing this?
So I look at two types of signals, the external signals and the internal signals. In terms of external signals, I look at objective measures of success. So was the work good based on whatever metrics? And I know it sounds very subjective, but there are objective metrics in general that you can rely on, whether that's qualitative feedback from people you work with telling you that presentation was amazing, or I really love this podcast. Or it can be more quantitative, number of subscribers, followers, click rates, all of that kind of stuff that you can look
Mm.
at to see if people are engaging with it. If you're a business owner and selling a product, you can even look at sales numbers based on an experiment that you've been running. If you're running a health related experiment, you can even look at your health data, your heart rate variability or your sleep scores or all of that kind of stuff. So
Mm.
those are all of the external metrics that you can look at, the kind of stuff that you could imagine you could put in a report if there was a
Mm.
report to someone else, which is really not always the case. And then internal signals. How did I actually feel
Mm.
while conducting this experiment? And this is equally important. As I mentioned earlier, you could be very successful when it comes to external signals, but you could be hating every single moment of working on this project.
Yeah.
And in that case, that kind of negative signal at the internal level is strong enough usually for me to decide that I'm not going to keep going with this, or that that's what that was the case with YouTube. I'm going to pause data collection for now, and I'm going to try and figure out if there's a different way to do this, whether by partnering with someone or completely changing the format of it in a way
Mm.
that feels more enjoyable. So those are the two things I'm looking at, the external and internal signals.
Gotcha. I feel like just as you know, giving you an idea that maybe you could try a podcast next time. Clearly, you love to have a conversation, and so whenever you pick that up, I think you'd probably thrive there. Um, I I thought of this when you were speaking is a lot of such experiments, even if it's just 2 weeks long, there's a ton of motivation on day one, probably even day two and three, and then it dips like that. And I've noticed this in myself again and again. So, how do people kind of push through that waning phase?
Two ways that can be helpful. The first one, I'm a big, big, big advocate for learning in public. I
Mm,
think that having
me
this
too.
type of commitment with others to conduct experiments together can be very helpful in terms of maintaining motivation. When you know that other people are also conducting their experiments, it helps a lot. That's also why in the Ness Labs community, I highly recommend people to start running experiments around the same time, even if
Mm,
it's not the same experiment. You may be running an experiment to know if maybe around meditation, for example. And I might be doing an experiment around learning how to paint. It doesn't really matter, but we can touch base and have conversations together and ask each other how this is doing, how things are going. And if you don't have someone around you that you can conduct an experiment with, we're very fortunate nowadays that we have so many different spaces online where we can do this. So
yeah.
wherever your community is, it could be on Instagram, it could be a private community, it could be really anywhere. WhatsApp groups also, where people are hanging out together and having conversations. You can have that accountability there. So that's one thing. And the second thing that's very important too is that those dips and motivation are also data for you to collect. It's
Mm,
very interesting to notice when you're less motivated, less excited, less interested. Why is that? Is it because it's a Monday and you don't have a lot of energy and then that's okay, but you can still make a note of this to notice if like, is it every Monday that I'm really struggling to do this? Maybe I should do this experiment on another day.
mm,
Is it when your day is very full? You had a lot of other things going on, and maybe your energy stores are completely depleted and you don't have energy for this experiment. Or is it something that is intrinsically wrong with the experiment itself? Something that sounded excited, but now that you've done it a few times, has become too easy and is a bit boring to you.
mm.
Maybe in your next iteration, you want to ramp up the challenge a little bit. Maybe that was too simple and you learned too fast. And now you're not motivated because there's no excitement, there's no challenge around the task itself. So looking at the lack of motivation not as something that is wrong, but as a potential source of information is also very helpful.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes is be curious, not judgmental. And generally, when people say that, they think it's towards other people, but really it's towards yourself and every aspect of life, really. So, what you're saying is don't judge yourself for losing motivation. Like, be curious. Why is that happening, first of all? Because I don't think people are inherently lazy. I think all of us want to get somewhere. And so, it's very, very helpful to hear. I was going to ask you about, you talked about the growth of your newsletter or the 100 article experiment that you've tried. Right now, you manage a ton of things. At least from the outside, I can see that there is a book that's coming out. You have a PhD, which you recently finished, right? Just last week. You got it. Huge congrats on that. So then I'm assuming you're going to probably teach next. And then there is your community newsletter. How do you manage all of this without feeling burnt out or feeling overwhelmed?
It's the opposite for me. The fact that I have different projects helps me progress through them better because anytime I'm a bit frustrated with one of them, I can switch to another one. So anytime I was working on PhD research and I felt a little bit stuck, I could take a little breather by just reading fun articles and look at research that had nothing to do with my PhD. So I could take some notes for my newsletter. Every time I was a bit stuck with something at Ness Labs, a process or a project that we were working on, I could go back to my PhD research because I had a plan and I knew there were a few things that needed to get done there in terms of my research. So for me, wearing different hats and working on several projects at the same time actually feels better in terms of productivity and creativity than working on one single project at a time. And I know not everyone works like that. And it took me, again, a little bit of experimentation and exploration for me to figure out that that's actually my ideal setup is to have a few projects. And the other reason why it works is the type of projects. A lot of these are kind of long-term projects without very fast-paced deadlines, right? So it's completely okay for me to move in between them in a more fluid way. I can write a little bit for a chapter for my PhD, write a little bit for an upcoming newsletter. I can go back and forth. I don't have a manager that is expecting me to deliver something by a specific date. So that's been very helpful. The type of projects also helps a lot. And the last thing I would say is my almost obsessive focus on my mental and physical health. And I'm not saying that, I'm not someone who goes to a gym a lot or who really obsesses with the way I eat or anything like this, but I pay a lot of attention to how I feel. And I always try to act based on this. So if I wake up one morning and I feel again that knot in my stomach, or I feel like my shoulders are stiff and or I feel a bit low or a bit empty, I will always listen to this. I will never ignore those signals. And I will always choose to be a bit late in terms of starting work that day and go for a walk or put some music on and dance in my living room on my own and look silly and it's fine. Nobody's watching me. And then I'll start working. I journal every morning. I go dance every week. I have all of these different things in my life where I'm making sure that my mental health can support my creative ambitions.
Yeah, it sounds like you have so many outlets for not even stress release. I guess these are like joy seeking more than stress release. Dancing in your living room or going for a dance class. I love dance, by the way, so fully resonate with what you just said. And I've read, you've talked about mental health a lot. In fact, your entire newsletter is around how do you be productive while keeping your mental health intact and, in fact, kind of flourishing that as well. So it's great to hear how you're doing that. I guess we've talked about productivity on this call without really using the word productivity yet, which, but I am curious. I Productivity has been a huge thing in the last 5 years. A lot of big name players in the field have come up launching books. I guess Tiny Experiments, you could also say, is another book to help you be more productive while keeping mental health in check. I'm curious, how do you think about productivity, and are there any productivity trends that used to work for you but they don't anymore?
This is such a good question. There definitely are. I have evolved a lot in terms of my relationship with productivity. And because I'm learning in public, I think just by going through articles on Ness Labs and tweets that I have posted, you can see this journey happening. At the beginning of my journey, I was always seeking systems, mental models, structure, tools. And I just felt like if you gave me the Eisenhower metrics, and if you gave me that three-step approach to managing your time, and if you gave me that tool I could download and copy paste into my system, then I would become productive. Very often, that actually didn't work. And when I didn't manage to get things done and be super productive by applying these tools, I always felt like something was wrong with me because obviously so many people were using these tools and somehow they didn't work for me. And now I have a much more flexible and fluid approach to productivity. I'm really okay playing with tools, taking a tool from someone and just tweaking it, changing something, adapting it to my own needs. I'm also completely okay with the idea that a system may be helpful for me for a very specific challenge I'm facing right now, but not all the time. So, for example, the Pomodoro technique for me is so helpful in crunch time. I have two papers to finish by the end of the week. I'm going to definitely use Pomodoro timers to get through those papers, write those first drafts, make sure I can send them to my supervisors to have their feedback by the deadline. Absolutely. But I'm not going to implement this as a day-to-day thing. I'm not going to have all of my days following Pomodoro timers after Pomodoro timers of work. And so that's the main evolution for me, going from this very prescriptive vision of productivity, where I thought there was almost a magic formula, something I could apply that would solve all of my productivity challenges in one go, to having this more do-it-yourself kind of approach and not blaming myself anymore when things don't work. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, approaching those challenges from a place of curiosity. And if a tool or a system or a model is not working for me, asking myself, what's going on here? What can I learn from this experience? And what can I change? What can I experiment with to try and figure out something that actually works for me?
When you were speaking, it really just sounded like, once again, tiny experiments. Try things, see if it works. And what you said, I want to emphasize, is that a productivity technique can work in a very specific instance, like Pomodoro, which is, for those who don't know, it's a 25-minute timer wherein you work for 25 minutes, take a break for 5 minutes, which has some scientific backing as well. I also remember trying that several years ago. But I feel like what you just said is just, it's not a cookie cutter solution for everyone. And it literally just means that we have different ways in which we look at things and how we perform on a daily basis. And I feel like I taught this course several years ago where I was rigorously counting the hours I would spend every week on every single project that I worked on, and then spending an hour every week looking at, did I do this right? Is the distribution great across all these projects? And now I realize that, once again, without judging the past self, I realize, I've evolved. Right now it's more about what makes you feel good. Do more of that. What makes you feel not so good? Do less of that. It's kind of a simpler framework. And it sounds like you're saying something similar, that kind of check with yourself how you feel and then use that as the compass as you move forward. That's amazing. I would love to know what is next for you now that your PhD is done. Your book is also done with at least the first version. What are you spending time on?
I actually don't know, and this is a great feeling. I've been really focused on these big projects for the past couple of years, longer than that, actually. And it's the first time in a few years where I have no plans, I have no clarity, to back to this liminal space of uncertainty. And I don't want to rush and decide what's next. I really want to enjoy that space of not knowing. So what's next for me is taking a little bit of time off. Time off for me, it still means I'm writing my newsletter, I'm still running my community, but I'm not going to start any other big project until I've had the time and the space to reflect and decide what my next experiment is going to be.
That's fantastic. I really hope that I'm sure there's many more books you'll be writing in your life. At least I can see that. And for what it's worth, I really like the name liminal. It's so nice to say it. The word liminal. I don't know why I like saying that, but that's fantastic. I do want to ask two last questions actually. One is 5 years ago, I guess you would have been in your late 20s back then, and you hadn't even started your newsletter at that point, right? In late 2020, 2019?
I started the newsletter at the end of 2019, so.
Oh, okay. Just started, right. So if you could go back by 5 years, what would you tell that little woman who was just starting out, something that could have changed her trajectory?
I would have told her that it's okay to reach out and ask for help from people who have walked this path before you did. I ended up connecting with so many amazing people that I learned from. And there were several of them, many of them, where once I started talking to them, I discovered, which sounds so silly right now, but that they were just human beings and that they were very warm and friendly and they just wanted to help. But before I talked to them, I just thought that they were those like creative behemoths that I would never be able to talk to and that I would bother them. So I would just tell the Anne-Laure in her late 20s who was about to start that newsletter that it's completely okay to reach out. It's okay to raise your hand and it's okay to say, hey, I'm just getting started with this thing and you've been doing this for a few years. Here are a few questions. And if the person doesn't reply, that's completely fine.
Right. The worst is that they don't respond, and that's really okay. Amazing. I was going to ask you, how can we support you, the people watching this? But I'm going to kind of answer for you by saying that I think the best thing that anyone watching this can do right now is to go and get tiny experiments, because honestly, it just sounds like a refreshing way of looking at an age-old concept of how do you get things done in your life. But is there any other way in which people can support you?
No, that's definitely the way to support my work and even to support yourself. I genuinely believe that this is a helpful book that is going to support people in discovering what they want to work on next and live a more curious and creative life.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I've been, I think I first came across your newsletter when you were just at few thousand subscribers, and I've kind of observed the growth from the sidelines over the years, and it's been such a beautiful pleasure to watch this happen and to know that you can quit your job in your late 20s. You can start a newsletter. You can grow that into a business. You can grow that into a community. You can get a PhD while doing all of this, and you can write a book too. So it's thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you so much. Yeah, anything is possible if you follow your curiosity.
Hey, if you enjoyed watching that and feel like getting your hands on tiny experiments, then here's something for you. I'm giving away 5 copies of Anne-Laure's book, Tiny Experiments, and all you have to do to enter the giveaway is simply visit the link in the description and enter your name and email. That's it. And if you're chosen, you'll be sent an email along with the next steps. All the very best, and thank you so much for watching this video. And before you go, hit the subscribe button if you want to watch more videos like this, as well as on topics around immigration, entrepreneurship, writing, and more.